Congratulations, Family Tabletop. You've brought me out of hiding. So there's this new channel. I think it's a new channel, relatively speaking. It's not like it's 15 years old or 7 years old or anything. Family Tabletop Gaming, mostly with Nate, I believe his name is. He talks about mostly role-playing games, but he also talks about board games and wargaming. He's a gamer, in the broad sense that covers lots of things. And I'm in his Discord now, and I was just listening to a video of his, which I'll of course have linked below if I do everything proper. GM tips for Game Master Noobs. And it was a conversation between him and his wife about, what does it mean? What are some advice? It was a good video. But I do have a couple thoughts from it. And I thought I would do this rather than sit down in the Discord. Because I kind of have this walking time right now at work that I can take advantage of. Not so much time at the Discord. And so just as a heads up, after I give my couple thoughts in response to the video, I'm going to also give a response to a question that he asked me in the Discord about world building methods, and so I'll address that afterwards. Okay? All right, let's roll. One of the concepts that Nate suggested not to do is what a lot of us know as the quantum ogre issue. If you're unfamiliar with that, that's generally, like in that title example, you've got a couple ogres for the players to fight, and they're in a particular room as they're going through this place. But the players decide not to open that door at all, and they go a different direction. And so the quantum part refers to, so do you just suddenly say they're not in that room, they're in this room over here, because you want to have them have this fight? And Nate was saying, hey, don't do that. That is not an absolute no. This is a question, much like some of his other points, about what are you trying to do? If you have a party that likes the combat, and this was the pace of combat that you wanted to do, this was the, you want this combat to stretch the player's resources, to test a tactical concern, make the players engage in something different, then yeah, quantum that ogre. Put it where you need it to be. This is really just a question of what is it your players are looking for and stuff like that. And while you might be prone to think only about combat for the perspective of the quantum ogre approach, it doesn't have to be only combat, right? This could also be, if you went here, you're going to run into this NPC that I wanted to introduce you to, but you don't go there. Fine. Then as long as it makes sense, put the NPC in a different location so that they can run into them. Because in some way, in order to have story beats that you're looking for, you manipulate that, right? Like it looks right. I'll just stop there. That's what you do. It is point 2, and kind of goes along with this idea. It is very interesting that, and I never thought about it before, that he said that his desire for not so much combat in his role-playing games, his tabletop role-playing games, is tied to, he thinks, the fact that he is a wargamer as well, right? Playing miniatures, Warhammer and stuff, and other games. And so that's where he gets his combat fix, if you will. And so he's not looking for that in his role-playing game. And I think that's a very interesting thing. And it might be, as a corollary, tied back to the quantum ogre thing. If you have a fight scheduled somewhere, but your group are not wargamers, you may be looking for a certain degree of combat. So his advice was to not do that. And that's might be coming from a perspective of, I've got Wargaming for that. I don't need that in my tabletop role-playing game. And so there's a condition there about whether or not that's good advice. So there's that. The next point that I wanted to talk about that he talked about in his advice video starts the segue to the world building thing, which is he was advising about how the pros and cons are different, the strengths and like the things that you have to worry about because you get to take it for advantage are different between, as he called them, lore medium and lore heavy game versus lore light or lore absent systems, right? So we're talking about role-playing systems that come with a setting and how detailed and information-rich that setting is. And he talked about the advantage of, players getting to dig in, and having a world that structures an idea for your campaign, and that helps inform your GMing on the fly, as you will eventually have to do as your players do things that you weren't expecting. Helping you design how NPCs are going to react to things because there's already an existing social structure and social issues going on, etc., etc. Versus completely very lore-light games being a little bit more like a war game where you just kind of make characters and you start making stuff up on the fly. And one of his thoughts about that was, and then trying to tie it all back together cohesively as the GM. I think that also comes back to that he has war games for his fighting hobby, and so he is looking for the very story-rich part of tabletop RPGs, which is I like that idea. I'm just not a wargamer, so that's where I get my combat on. But the thought that I had about that is that's all true for RPGs that provide a setting, and then the question is to how lore rich is that setting? It's a completely different question for generic systems, for settingless systems. When you have to decide, these are the mechanics we're using, but where are we using them? If you choose to say, I'm just going to convert Harry Potter IP, Potterverse IP into this, or Star Wars IP into these mechanics, and we're just going to play there, then you have the same advantage that lore medium and lore heavy settings give you. And if you take a lore light setting from another system and use it in some other generic setting, you have all the same pros and cons there as well. But when you take advantage of the settinglessness to create your own setting, now we're talking about a whole different thing. Because you get some advantage of, okay, now I know how things are directed, in which direction they're going to go, and I can, figure out plot threads, what the NPCs are after, etc., etc. But there isn't that tertiary data source for your players. And this is something, as anyone who's watched this channel for a long time knows, as a Rollmaster GM who made his own setting starting back in 2000, that's one of the struggles. My players, I have to spend so much time in character generation explaining concepts and world settings and the world in general to my players. Especially since I hate tropes. I talked about that in another video sometime, 2 years ago or something, 3 years ago. I hate tropes, and so I'm usually trying to break them. And so I put myself in a bit of a pickle, right? So here's this lore-rich place where I've made up a lot of stuff. I know the cosmology, all this stuff. I invite my players to create things. Then they have ideas, and I'm like, crap, I like that idea, but it doesn't fit into what already exists. I think as a history, I think I've been inflexible with that. I should have tried to figure out how those things could fit and use them anyways. But more to the point, to talk about what Nate was talking about, you can have a lore-rich setting when it's your own setting, and that still ends up being really difficult for the players to latch onto, because there isn't this tertiary source. They don't know it from books, games, movies, you know. So that creates a little bit of struggle there. In my more recent setting that I was working on, I put my original setting aside and I started working on another setting. I did much more of just the broad strokes and sat down with the players. Like, what we were doing was, let's just play here in this area with these people, with this people type, right? So let's talk about who they are. What are some cultural things? What's their history? Which classes and types of magic are more prevalent or less prevalent in this area? Stuff like that. And so my players were involved with that. So my players that have done that are already that much more familiar with who those people are. And so that was very nice. Third and final point from his GM advice video for noobs. He was talking about how he had heard from other players, from other people on like comments on YouTube videos, I guess, NPCs are super important. Make those people that the players can either really like or really hate. Make them relevant, and talking about the benefit that he immediately saw out of that. And I think that's great advice and something I need to think about, because it's actually something I haven't done. I try to make interesting NPCs if they're at least moderately important. I don't always put enough time into that part of my planning process to get a lot of mileage out of it. But secondly, here's the thing to watch out for, GMs, is if your players are traveling, those NPCs become irrelevant, which might be why I was just intuiting not to put that much work into them, because my players were usually traveling. They were going from one location. I hope this wind isn't messing things up. They're going from one location to another, like across a country. And so if those NPCs were never traveling NPCs, because I didn't want the work of having to manage them in any kind of combat or anything like that. I have plenty of work to deal with just the NPCs, the actual enemies. And so they didn't really get to necessarily really get attached in a positive or negative sense to these NPCs, which is interesting. I'd never really thought about making that a higher importance, and then what I would have to do to do that, i.e. make a local game, like a game that's local, right? Like it's based out of this city. So yeah, you might go out to this mine or this dungeon, or this mountaintop, whatever, somewhere else, but you come back to the same place. Wow, this wind. Not even in Nebraska anymore, jeez. So I thought that was interesting. All right, we're going to transition to answering the question that was on the Discord. The question on the Discord was, because I was talking about what I do with setting this stuff, and that I did world building, both top down and a more bottom up approach. And Nate's like, what's that? Please explain more. Or he didn't say what's that, but he said, please explain more. And so I'm guessing that's because he might be unfamiliar with those terms, or somebody else is unfamiliar with those terms, and so I'm going to talk about them. So, top-down world building is basically start with the most absolute fundamentals and build your world out from there. So, yeah, I had some random program generate me a JPEG that was a random world, and I knew which races I was going to have and such, but things really got fleshed out. My actual world building really started with deciding the cosmology. Are there gods? Is there a god or gods? And if there is, what did creation look like? And if there are, is this a solved mystery or an unknown mystery? I.e., is there objective proof that gods exist, or is it all just belief? And therefore also like how the belief can go a little wrong. Let's see if I can stand behind this car, block the wind. And then and you go from there, right? Okay, what's the next thing? You work your way down. Like, what's the world history? Where do all the people live? Stuff like that, until you get smaller and smaller. Here's the pros and cons of that. You start with a structure that gives you like an outline, right? Like you're starting with, well, what's possible and what's not possible. And obviously you could always kind of like, since the world doesn't exist yet per se, you haven't put players in it touching grass. You can always, use an eraser, right? And go back and be like, well, I want this thing to be true, but that violates with this other thing I thought of earlier. So how can I either make that fit or I change the thing that I thought of earlier? Because I'd really want to include the smaller idea. Okay, whatever, you do that. So you have a bit of a structure and a guideline for the rest of your world creation. And also, it gives the setting as a whole a flavor, I suppose, if you're thinking about that kind of thing. I probably wasn't back in 2000, but there's an advantage. And it gives you a background to be like, okay, well, how do these people feel about those people? Well, I already know that they had a war 200 years ago. They're probably not over that, So how's this NPC going to react to this guy? Well, because I decided there was a war, I could lean into some default animosity or something like that, right? What are the cons? The cons for this is that's a lot of stuff to have to do. A lot. And you might get to the point where you actually get boots on the ground in a particular part of your setting and realize this isn't how this should be. This doesn't match my original concept. Like, I went astray here and I went awry. I had that happen with my Wood Elf country. Like, the way that they were. I had all these ideas of what they were like, and then I got to more thinking about, wait a second, why would they have cities? They don't have cities, and why do they do this? They wouldn't do that, because I made these their values. But I hadn't actually played in that area of the world yet, and so I didn't see how much that didn't work. And so I didn't, thankfully, but had I had like a Wood Elf NPC or player character for that matter that was important, and I told them these values, but then also these other things, I don't know, maybe I would have either realized that earlier or I would have later realized that the things I told this player don't really make sense. Also, it's a real pain in the butt to go through and be like, what's the economy system in each one of these countries? And what's the marriage rituals? Like, who does what? Is it all arranged marriages? The males seek the females, the females seek the males? Is it always one-to-one? Is it polygamy? Blah, 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 blah. Right, like, going through all those things, I have, like, demographics. Like, I have racial makeup of each country and, therefore, the major religions of each country. Like, I have a lot of information. And most of it's not needed. But, like, in play, most of it's not needed. So that's one of the other, as a GM, something that Nate didn't say, as a GM, one of the things is, as you do this prep, be okay with the fact that half or more of what you prep is not gonna hit the table. It's not gonna hit the table because the players are gonna go somewhere else. And so, as he said, you gotta be flexible and be okay with them not engaging with what you prepared. But the other side of that coin is that means you now have more stuff to make, or you have stuff that you made that's not getting played with, and so that might make you feel like maybe you shouldn't do that prep. And if you get good enough with making stuff off the cuff, you can do that. So world building from the bottom up is the exact reverse, right? And it makes more sense for localized campaigns, right? So if you're going to start in like a city and work up from there, or not work out from there, then you're coming up with details of the neighborhood that your player character's in. And when they say, well, we're looking for this thing, and you're like, well, it's over in this quarter of the town, and you really haven't put any thought into that yet, but they go there, well, then you need to start making it up, right? And as they deliver a message to a rival nation for the king, then now you're making up the space in between and the city that you arrive in, the capital city that you arrive in to deliver this other nation. And you're coming up, that's when you decide to come up with what are the customs here and who lives there and how's their architecture different and stuff like that. That's when you start coming up with that stuff. You don't think about it beforehand. You think about it when you need it, and you build it as you go. Not necessarily at the table, though that's possible, but at the very least, just in your prep work, that's when you decide to start making that stuff up. So there you go. Obviously, let me think about pros and cons. I haven't really done a whole lot of that, right? But pros and cons are a lot less work. Like I probably worked on my setting for a full year or more, my first setting for a full year or more before I ever actually ran a game in it, because I didn't feel like I was done enough, right? I wanted answers for nearly everything. And so you get to play a lot faster. Another pro to bottom-up world building is you can more immediately involve your players. Since you could do some of it at the table or in between sessions, like, hey, what do you think this should be like? Blah, 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 and get some ideas. You can involve your players a lot more than in top-down. I think top-down works, maybe it either leads itself towards a lot of secrets that the players get to explore, which means you can't really involve them. Or, on the other hand, you can have another set of eyes trying to make sure your tones and your setting ideas are consistent, and how to apply this in different places. And so a con of bottom up is in a way that's different than top down world building. You're never done. Like you're kind of never done with top down either, because you've got more details to work out, because you can't work out everything. But at least you have a framework. When you go to a new city, you've got a framework. Bottom up, you don't have that framework. And so each one of those chunks of world building you're doing is more holistic. You have so much more of that to do because you haven't done any of it yet. And you may not have all that many parameters to bind your work and put it in a particular direction. And so that work is, you don't, like Nate talked about, like prepping before you get into the games by studying the lore on these lore medium and lore rich settings. You can't do that when you're building bottom up. You're just constantly working at it. As long as your players are going into a new place, you have more world building to do. But I think in some ways that might also help towards that cohesiveness. I guess they both have ways that they work towards cohesiveness, bottom up and top down methods. Both have ways that help build towards cohesiveness. That's it. I don't really want to talk about that anymore. This is a 25-minute video. I'm outie. Later.